Hi, my name is Dr. Michael Lasher. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I work primarily with individuals who've committed sexual offenses. Through the course of this work, I have adopted, as part of my program that I work with, the look assessment as a viewing time measure of sexual interests. I have found the look assessment to be a pretty good tool. I really enjoy using it. I have only one concern, which is how the information is presented when the report is sent to you. As someone with a background in statistics and research, I figured there might be opportunities given the amount of information that the look team gives you in the report. So based on that, I realized I could put together a reprocessed report, which I have come to call the Enhanced Visualization System, or EVS for short. If you're watching this video, you've probably made it here through my website, dynamicpsych.net, where you can upload your look output report that you get from the look software and receive a processed EVS report. Given that I am currently, at this time, making this freely available, originally I had planned on charging a fee for service, and perhaps I may have to start doing that again depending on how much attention this gets. If the overhead cost for hosting the EVS becomes much more, I may have to consider that in the future, but at least as of this time in 2025, it is freely available for anyone who is qualified to use it. So given that, I've put together this video to give you a brief overview of what the different information in the EVS 1.1 report is that I've put together and how to best interpret that. So what is the EVS? In brief, the EVS is an enhanced interpretive system for the look assessment. I very clearly want to state that nothing I am talking about here, nothing I've worked on, is meant to be a replacement for the look assessment. We do not have any access to the look software beyond having a licensed use agreement. This is purely based on open source software to process the information and then putting together coding some code to process it online. So nothing we are doing here means that you will not, you'll be able to use the EVS rather than the look assessment. Indeed, you need to use the look assessment, get the information from the look assessment report, and then convert that into the EVS report. And I should note that we are not associated with the look team whatsoever. Don't get me wrong, wonderful people, would be really proud to work more closely with them, but this is not endorsed by the look assessment team. This is not reviewed by the look assessment team, and I am not paid or receive any other sort of benefits from the look assessment team. As far as the actual qualifications for EVS use, one of the key pieces is to be an authorized trained user of the look assessment, because again, you need to have that report that the look assessment generates. So you need to be getting that from the look software. So if you have been trained to use the look assessment, hopefully you understand how they are advising you to interpret their own report, which should give you some of the basics about what information is included in this. Along with that though, you should have a general understanding of human sexuality, particularly as it relates to sexual offending behavior. Some of the information in here could potentially be misinterpreted if you are not familiar with some of the research around human sexuality and sexual attraction patterns. I am not going to go too terribly in depth in that in this video, but there is research out there, and if you have questions about that, I'm always free to discuss that if you want to reach out to me. If you are viewing this on dynamicpsych.net, you can go to up here somewhere on the menu bar. There should be a contact or about tab to get in touch with me, or if you look down all the way on the bottom of the page, I know there's definitely a contact link down there. So you can always reach out to me, and I'm always happy to have that discussion. And along with that is to have a basic understanding of psychometrics and statistics. One of the things I will say is the EVS report does go a lot more in depth into statistical analyses than the standard look assessment report. There is some complex information in here, and that's why I'm putting this video together, to give you a brief primer on what that means. But as far as understanding like the basic of knowing, you know, when a statistic is significant, that's one thing. You'll find on some of the graphs that p-values are marked. So p is, you know, where p equals 0.05 is. You know, your basic significance in most research is p is less than 0.05. So you start to see where the different significance levels are on something like that. The contents itself of the EVS, first and foremost, once you get past there's a few explanation pages, but the first page that's generated is outliers and initial validity. One of the things I will say on that is when you get trained on the look assessment itself, they advise that you can remove 2 outliers from your from the viewing times that are provided to you once you look at your initial report. One of the things in the look training that they talk about is that if it's obvious that a person is distracted for something, then you might want to take that out. And I think that's a great idea. One of the challenges I personally ran into is when I would look at that report, I wouldn't really know, you know, if I was concerned someone may have gotten distracted or something to that effect, I wouldn't necessarily know which one that was. I think it would be obvious if someone was distracted for a significant prolonged period of time. But as far as sort of the minor distractions that go on, particularly when you are in an inpatient facility, like I am, for instance, there may be noises, there may be things that leak through the walls as far as sounds go, and other things. But it's hard to know, is there really a distraction going on? What I have done as part of the EVS is to look for statistical outliers within each group. So this is based on a comparison of the patterns of scores. You have 10 ratings for each category. If one of those items is statistically significantly longer, than the rest of the category, then that may indicate that there was something going on with that particular one that does not match the pattern, and then that the EVS suggests that's an outlier and automatically removes it. The other thing that the look team suggests in their training, and directly within their software, you can't remove more than 2 outliers. Specifically, you can't remove more than one outlier from one category, or 2 outliers overall. For the sake of simplicity, I have not been able to code that degree of specificity into the EVS at this time, but if you do get more than 2 outliers overall, it will, on the first page, along with identifying what those outliers are, it will indicate that you've had more than 2 outliers and that you really should interpret the report with extreme caution. And essentially what we're saying there is that you probably shouldn't treat it as particularly valid. So that's something to consider with that. After that, you will see a graph with the z-scores for both the viewing times and the self-reports. When you look at the look report itself, one of my personal frustrations is that there wasn't a easy way to compare the viewing times with the self-reports. It's on there, but I wasn't particularly happy with the way they presented it. You get to the last page and it gives you the z-scores for the different categories, and I found that very helpful. And if there was a more easier to use comparison between that and the self-report scores, I think that would have been great. So what I've done is I have created a graph here. The EVS shows you a graph that puts both the viewing time z-scores as well as z-scores for the self-reports side by side. That will become useful as we move through this, as you'll see. Second thing you'll see is called relative variance levels across groups. So whereas the first bar graph is giving you the z-scores for the different groups, The second bar graph tells you that if there is a particular group, either self-report or viewing time, does that particular group show more variance than the overall pattern? And we'll talk about that as we get into that. It'll make sense when I talk about it, I promise. The fourth graph you'll see is to look for significance variance between the viewing times and the self-reports themselves. So there will be some cases where it's very obvious there's a difference between a person's viewing time on a category and what they report as how attractive the people in that category are. For those times when it's a little bit more ambiguous if that difference is meaningful, the third bar graph will give you some data on, for every category, every of the 14 categories, whether or not there is a statistically significant difference between the viewing time and the self-report. After this, we get into something a little bit more complicated and something pretty cool and pretty fun. Next thing we do is what we call the hierarchical cluster modeling for the viewing time, or the objective measures of the look assessment. As I get into this and explain it more in depth, it'll make more sense, I hope. But hierarchical cluster modeling is a method for determining in a series of data what groups run together, in so many words. So there's two graphs that go with this. First, the silhouette graph, and then the actual cluster graph. And when I give you some examples, I will explain what those mean. After we do it for the viewing times, we do the same process for the self-reports. And then the last graph in the EVS is called a tangogram, which essentially looks at what is the correlation, what are the parallels between the cluster modeling for the objective, the viewing time measures, and for the cluster modeling for the self-report or the subjective measures. It gives you a little bit of information there about how statistically similar the two cluster graphs are, as well as some correlative data as far as, or a correlation statistic to see overall, is there an association between a person's viewing times and a person's self-report of attraction. So I'm going to go through 4 case examples that highlight some different ways that this can be interpreted. There's not a clear-cut yes-no attraction piece to this. It is giving you more information. That means there's more information to interpret. Again, this is part of the reason why I've made this video, is to give you the opportunity to have an understanding about how to use it, since it does require a decent amount of interpretation. So in our first case example, here is our z-scores for our viewing time measures and our self-reports. Now, as you can see on here, under the adult female category, we have a very significant elevation on both the viewing time measure z-score, which is in blue, it says objective response, and the self-report measure is in gray, it says self-report here. So both of these are significant at below the 0.001 level. There are no other self-reports or viewing times z-scores that rise to that level. Now, one of the things I'm going to note here is there are only p-values listed for elevations. We would consider this a one-tailed significance test. If you go back to your intro to stats course from grad school, or maybe even undergrad, you can think of that as half of the bell curve. Essentially, we are not attending to anything that is significant on the negative side. Essentially, we are looking for elevations for possible indications of positive attraction. We're not really looking for indications of non-attraction. We're assuming that if they are hovering closer to the mean, then that's more indicative of them not being attracted to that category. So in this case, the z-scores themselves seem to be pretty straightforward. When we look at the variance between categories, this gets a little bit more complicated, and I'm actually going to put the full graph on your screen so we can talk about this. So what you're seeing here is that the red bar for adult females represents the amount of variance between all of the responses, viewing time responses for adult females. Compared to the variance within all the other categories, there is a lot more, significantly more overall variance within that group than others. Now, in this case, since this is the only category that they're showing any response to, that's probably not surprising. In some of the other cases we'll get into, you'll start to see where this may be more meaningful. But in this case, what we're seeing is that at below the below the 0.01 level, this person's ratings of our viewing times for adult females varied more, significantly more than the variance for other categories. But again, this was, to go back for a second, this was really the only category that showed any response. Is it possible that there was some manipulation going on, where they were trying to stretch it out? This is where you would want to refer back to your original look assessment report and maybe manually examine the different individual viewing times. And even though the EVS, I'll tell you in this report, they didn't catch any outliers in this case, that might be something to consider. Is it that they are scoring enough, or they were pausing enough that it wasn't pinging as an outlier, but perhaps there was something else going on where some of them they were going quickly, some of them they were not going quickly. Were they rushing through all the other ones for non-adult females? Certainly there is a lot of ways that an individual could potentially try to manipulate something like this. It's not simple, it's not easy, but we're not going to pretend that there aren't opportunities to try and fake good or fake bad. And that's part of the reason why we're looking at this, is to have a deeper, more comprehensive examination of the data. So after that, as far as the difference in between the group variance within the category, so here we see that for juvenile females there's a significant elevation on this. And what this means, if we go back to this, under juvenile females, the viewing time response was up here in the positive z-score territory, whereas the self-report was in the negative z-score territory. So what this graph is telling us is that within that category there was greater than expected difference between the viewing time and the self-report. Now, again, to put this in context, is that meaningful? Here, given how minimal the response was to juvenile females as far as the viewing time goes, and understanding that for adult men who are primarily attracted to adult women, the potential for attraction to adolescent females, while there are still social barriers biologically, is a smaller response to that necessarily pathological, maybe not. So in this case, that's not something we would necessarily hold against them. Now we get into the cluster modeling. So on this, the cluster modeling, as I mentioned, there are two graphs. First, there is the silhouette chart, which will show you what is the number of clusters if you take all 14 of these groups and try to break them into the lowest common denominator of different of subgroups, for lack of a better word, less than 14. What is the best configuration? What is the most significant configuration? In this case, we see that there are two groups that give you the strongest configuration. Up here, you have a statistic called the optimal average silhouette width. And essentially what that is kind of an effect size of how strong this configuration is. So down here on the bottom, it says model strength is strong. So for silhouette widths that are greater than 0.75, we would consider those strong configurations. Between 0.5 and 0.75, we would consider those moderate configurations as far as the effect. And then between 0.25 and zero point 0.5, we would consider those weak but valid. Anything below 0.25, we wouldn't consider that a valid configuration. And we'll take a look at a case like that in a minute. But for the meantime, this case, example number 1, this is a case where two groups were the most significant, the strongest configuration. So what we have here, and it does have all abbreviations. If you go back to the beginning of the EVS report, you'll see what these abbreviations mean if you're not directly familiar with them, and they're not quite the same as what's in the look report. But we have all the way up at the top, it is the adult female category, F80L. And then down below that, and slightly to the right, everything else is in a big green box, clustered together, including mature females, juvenile females, which are kind of off on their own, and then everything else is sort of clustered vertically pretty tightly. When you are looking at a hierarchical cluster model dendrogram, as this is called, really what you're looking at is the difference in distances vertically in this case. Sometimes you'll see them horizontal, but in this case we're looking at them vertically. So there is a big difference between where female adults clustered and then everything else tended to cluster relatively closer together. There was some clustering over here with mature females and juvenile females, adolescent females, but that was much closer in pattern to everything else than it was to adult females. So in this case, not surprisingly, given what we saw with those Z-scores, the adult females are clustering together, and we can generally say this reflects that it is a category that probably reflects sexual attraction or sexual interest, whereas these reflect less interest or no interest, depending on the context of what you're looking at. I'm going to skip to the dendrogram for the self-report data. Essentially, you're doing the same thing with the silhouette chart and the dendrogram. Again, here you could see that everything is relatively clustered tightly together on the vertical level. This individual is scoring -3 for most everything other than adult females. There was a little ping on older adult females, but for the most part, he was only really saying that the only people he was sexually interested in when he was self-scoring was the adult females. This may be of less use to people, but if questions come up, I thought this was helpful to have. So this is what I mentioned was the tanglegram, is the term that we would call this. What we're looking at is each dendrogram on each side. So on this side we have our viewing time dendrogram, on this side we have our self-report dendrogram. The tanglegram looks for how much consistency there is between the two dendrograms in the different cluster models. The Baker's gamma statistic at the bottom is a measure of whether or not, how correlated the dendrograms themselves are. The research on it, the development on the Baker's gamma statistic and this kind of analysis suggests that a gamma value of 0.7 or greater reflects that they are relatively similar. Less than 0.7, they are relatively dissimilar. It's not really viewed on a continuum the way we would normally look like a correlation coefficient. One of the things I have found in doing several of these and working on it is that it is pretty sensitive to how there are variations in the viewing time measures, but less variation within the self-report. So for instance, an individual who is both self-reporting and viewing time scores also reflect that they are exclusively heterosexual. They are going to have a certain amount of variation on their male viewing time scores, but their self-report scores are going to be pretty consistently -3. So this is going to be kind of sensitive to that, and so the Baker's gamma statistic might be a little deflated. I haven't really had an opportunity to do enough analysis to set my own norm for this, so for right now I'm continuing to advise the 0.7 cutoff consistent with other use of Baker's gamma. But what I've also included is a correlation coefficient. Most people are familiar with the Pearson correlation, normally represented by R. To cut to the chase, given the layout of the data, I am using in the EVS what's called a partial Kendall's tau. It's still interpreted generally the same way a normal correlation would be interpreted, where you're looking at -1 to +1. The closer you get to 1, either positive or negative, the stronger the relationship. But here it handles the data a little bit differently than a Pearson correlation would. So we have a tau of 0.379, which is statistically significant. The significance is so strong that it just says p equals 0 when I printed this one out. And so what that's saying is that the item-to-item self-reports and viewing times, there's generally a correlation going on here that we could say that there's some correlation to this. But there are some differences, and again, those differences are probably being sensitive to the variations on the male items, and also the difference between the self-report on female juveniles and the viewing times on female juveniles that we saw with the yellow bar graph earlier on. So that is the overall explanation of what the EVS looks like on a relatively basic case. Now, most of our cases are not going to be this basic, so let's look at a couple more. So on example case number 2, I didn't show you this on number 1, but this is what your outlier and initial validity report is going to look like. So in this case, there was one outlier identified, and you can actually use this to go back to your original loop report and figure out which case this was, just in case. So the column be pre-juvenile females, row number 10. So basically you would go over to your pre-juvenile female column and then go all the way down to the 10th one. As you know, there's only 10 targets in each category, so it'd be easy to pick out the last one. And this also tells you that the viewing time on this was 3.12, so you can also pick that out. So you can visually contrast that to the other ones if you need to, but that gives you that information. Here is what the z-scores for the viewing times and the self-reports look like for this individual. What you can see here is there are 2 significant ratings. First, there is one significant viewing time, which is for mature females, and there is one significant self-report, which is for adult females. So, bigger picture, if we assume for a second that this is an individual who had a sexual offense at some point in time against someone who was under the age of consent, there may be concerns about whether or not this person has a persistent sexual interest in juvenile females, for instance. This in of itself would suggest that's probably not what's going on. Now, there was probably something else driving that sexual offense. That being said, let's take a deeper look at this individual. What we can see here, there were no groups that showed greater variance than would be expected. So his responding patterns all seem pretty genuine. It's hard to do a significance, to say a non-significant result is indicative of something if you understand significance testing. But in general, sort of an off-the-cuff examination, if I was looking at this, I said, okay, there's no cases that really stand out as far as having inconsistency within the groups. So there's probably a pretty good chance that he took it seriously. At the very least, there's no evidence here of distraction or manipulation. Now, when we look at the variance between the self-reports and the viewing times, there's definitely a few things that pinged here. Not surprisingly, the female adult group showed a lot of variance between the viewing time and the self-report. Again, the person in question is saying he's attracted to people in that age category, but he's responding to slightly older people. It's a little surprising we didn't see that with the mature females. So let's go back for a second, and we can see here that the self-report on mature females, it's not significant, but it's not quite suppressed either. So he is giving some response or some acknowledgement of interest in that age group, just not as strongly as he's identifying interest in the 20 to 30-year-old pictures of females. The other thing we saw was within the pre-juvenile category there was a significant difference, but when we look at that, there seemed to be a pretty low latency in terms of the viewing times on that. And again, we're primarily looking at this from a one-tailed test perspective. We're not looking at testing for negatives. You can make an argument that there might be something going on there, but that would be pretty much supposition. When we look at his patterns of responding, now here's where some things might get a little interesting. Again, 2 groups was the optimal configuration for the objective cluster analysis. In this case, it was a valid configuration, but it was a weak configuration. Generally, I would not lose a lot of sleep about it being weak versus moderate versus strong. I think the important thing is that it's valid at all. So in this case, it is valid, so it's okay to move forward. And here you can see that for the viewing times, mature females, it does stand on its own. So there's a possibility, if we go back for a second, there's this question, would adult females, the response that he's showing here, it's not significant, but would it be more closely associated with the mature female significant response or all the other responses which are closer to the mean? According to the cluster analysis, the responses to adult females cluster more closely with everything else. Now, unlike the first case we looked at, there's not that big vertical difference. So there's a smaller gap between the non-attraction group and the attraction group here, but nevertheless, we can say that he is having a more unique response to that age category as opposed to the others. When we look at his self-report, again, 2 groups were formed, but here it's a little bit different. On his self-report, mature and adult females clustered together. So rather than the viewing time where mature females stood by itself, here we could see that his responses, his self-report responses to mature adults and adults in the female categories were pretty overlapping. So when I was sitting down with this person, this is an actual case. When I was sitting down with this person, this is something to talk about. It's like, look, you're getting a little bit older. This person, he's in his 50s. It's like, getting a little bit older. Our responses can change over time. You're saying that your interest is, you're acknowledging an interest in people across these different ranges, but maybe there's something else going on that is reflecting in your latency and in your viewing times to mature adults or slightly older adults closer to your own age than these adults who are younger. So, I mean, I'm not going to go too in-depth about this person's history, but there was definitely something to discuss there when we were looking at it. In this case, the tangogram was not reaching that 0.7 level. It was close. I mean, indeed, you could probably round up and say, kind of rounds up to 0.7. But in general, there was enough differentiation there that we would say that there's a difference between his subjective responses, the clusters of his subjective responses, and the cluster of his objective responses. Nevertheless, he did have a statistically significant correlation between his viewing time responses and his self-reports. So let's talk about our third example. In example number 3, no outliers were identified, so no outlier report was generated. Moving on. In this case, again, we see some differences, similar into our second case, we see some differences in the viewing time versus the self-reports. Here things are starting to get a little bit more complicated. And you'll see as we move through our different examples, the further along we get, the more complicated they're going to get. In this case, he was showing a significant response in the viewing time to juvenile females, so adolescent females. He was not reporting significant attraction on the self-report to that category, but he was to adult females. In our world where we're working with justice-involved people, this starts to be a consideration where an individual's objective responses reflect something not absolutely pathological, but possibly pathological. In other cases, maybe there is a pathological response, a clearly pathological response, if there was more response to pre-juveniles or small children. But again, going back to what I was saying, there is some data that suggests responses to adolescent female among men is not necessarily pathological, but there's not that corresponding response to adult females here. So we start to get a little bit more concerned in that sense. When we look at the variance, there was one group that showed more variance than expected, which was senior males. But we're not really talking about that. If we go back to our z-scores for a second, we're not really focused on that. That's not something that's really going to be informative to us. Really what we're concerned about based on our first set of data is the adult females and the juvenile females. So there is no significant variance in those groups, which to me suggests that these are relatively consistent responses. It creates a relatively consistent pattern within those groups. Probably not an attempt to manipulate anything. This is probably something genuine, but as we put this person in context, there may be other factors. I think that's a good place for us to pause for a second and remind that the look assessment should not be used in isolation, nor should the EVS. This definitely needs to be put into context of other information, including a review of records, including an interview, possibly other psychometric testing. But again, we need to put these things in context. I am familiar with these cases, so I may be talking about them a little off the cuff, but I'm illustrating different issues for consideration when you're looking at this yourself. So it seems I did not include the third bar graph, but that's not terribly important here. Okay, we generally know that there's some differences there, and let's assume, since I forgot to include that, sorry, that there is significant differences between the self-report and the objective viewing time measure on adult females, as well as on juvenile females, and a couple other things, but those are going to be our areas of concern for right now. For our objective measurement, our viewing time cluster graph, our dendrogram, juvenile females clustered by himself. Nothing else showed a response similar enough to juvenile females. Everything else would be considered in the lower attraction group. Juvenile female stands alone in the higher attraction group. Surprisingly, on his self-report, adults, juveniles, and mature adults did cluster together. So there may have been something going on where he's reporting higher attraction to adults across a wider group. He's not saying he's not attracted to juveniles. There's some insight there, but there is definitely more response to adults than his viewing time would suggest. The dendrogram is actually quite lower in terms of the Baker's gamma than others. Here we only have a 0.337. And the correlation between these is only 0.09. It's not significant. So there's definitely more going on here in terms of the difference between the objective response and the subjective response. And now we can really start to see how that might look like when we're talking about a more definitive difference. What I will say in this case, this is a case where it might reflect, I don't want to give too much information about the individual way, might reflect some denial of sexual attraction to adolescents as opposed to adults. This person was not, the term, I don't see it used as much, but once upon a time we would call this ego dystonic. We would talk about this more in terms of people who are manifesting straightforward pedophilic interests. Ego dystonic versus ego syntonic. This person might represent some ego dystonic attraction to individuals who are adolescents as opposed to adults. I will say this person was firmly in adulthood without saying how old he actually is. This is a person who was firmly in adulthood, so it wasn't like he was on the cusp of adulthood. There was definitely a significant, or I shouldn't say significant in this, but there was a notable difference in his age versus the ages of people that he is objectively expressing attraction to. There may be other things going on as far as, was he distracted? Was he nervous? Definitely something that you'd want to debrief about, but in the case of possible denial about attraction, stronger attraction to juveniles or potentially risky age groups as opposed to less risky age groups, this definitely gave us, in this case, some data for us to talk about in treatment for this individual. So here's where the EVS really starts to shine a little bit, and you can, again, if I have my yellow graph here, definitely had that discussion. It's like, yeah, you did have big difference. You're saying you are attracted to adults, but look how strong the difference is on the between groups within the same category, the subjective versus the objective. I should note we are getting a little bit technical as we're getting into this. If you find yourself following along easily, that's awesome. As a data person, as a statistics person, I'm always excited to talk about this. When we're talking about this with the people we work with, there's always the possibility that we are working with people that do have some education as far as math and statistics goes. Lord knows I've worked with a number of college-educated people over the years. But it is fairly safe to assume that the average person who's involved in the justice system isn't conducting advanced variance analyses. So this is why it's important to have this understanding about what these different data points mean, what these different statistical functions mean, so that when we are debriefing with the people who we are assessing, we are able to communicate that in ways that they are able to understand. So there is that also to take into consideration. The last person we're going to talk about, case number 4. As I said earlier, these cases are getting more complicated as we go on. This is the most complicated out of all 4 cases we're going to talk about. So in this case, 2 outliers were identified, one in the senior female category and one in the mature male adult category. I will preface this by saying this is an individual who has had multiple offenses against male children. When he was interviewed for his assessment that this was a part of, he said that his attraction is exclusively towards adult males. There was a lot of information beyond just his offense history, which wasn't very extensive, but nevertheless there was a lot of information that leaned more towards him being diagnosed with a pedophilic disorder or another specified paraphilic disorder related to attraction to not just prepubescent minors, but individuals under the age of consent in general. Here what we see is some interesting stuff though. As far as his self-report goes, not surprisingly, he is saying the only group he is strongly, significantly attracted to is adult males, which is consistent with his self-report earlier in the evaluation. His viewing times, though, showed significant elevations for juvenile males, so adolescent males, but also for adult females. Now, this individual has had a history of relations with adult females. He actually, this person actually has a child by a woman. But that didn't really reflect their overall pattern of sexual attraction, which we know is going to be relatively stable over time. So there's definitely more things going on there in terms of the social dynamics in that relationship than just sexual attraction, and that's a conversation for another time. When we look at the variance bar graph, the adult female group showed a very significant response. So although there were no outliers detected in this group, there was a wider spread of viewing times than would be expected. This is where we need to take a step back and consider, is this an attempt at throwing off the direction? Is this reflective of the individual having something distracting him looking at the photos? Without going into details, that was a hypothesis in terms of discussing it with our team. But yeah, I mean, this is definitely saying while there is a significant response there, in this case, historically, contextually, this is not consistent with his behaviors and his self-reports. So there's probably something else going on there. This is probably not a valid response as far as the significant elevation of the viewing time. Probably not something that we would consider a valid response. Probably noise. Probably an overall misread on something like that. So it's really putting together this variance information as well as the context from the interview and the history. Very important. When we look at the between groups within the categories, we can see that there are a number of groups here that he's showing difference between his self-report and his viewing times. Most notably is the adult male category. So if we go back, this person is saying, I'm primarily attracted to adult males. Look at this, all my scores so significantly. Look at that, I'm saying repeatedly, this is what I'm attracted to, but what we can say is that there is more difference between your self-report there than any other category. It's clearly not consistent. Now, when we get into the hierarchical cluster analysis, again, two groups were the optimal configuration. However, the optimal silhouette width in this case was only 0.14, which falls below the cutoff for a valid score. In a case like this, it's going to tell you right off the bat, model strength invalid. It is still going to generate the dendrogram for you, but essentially don't use it. It's not information that comes out in a valid configuration. When you look at this dendrogram, and I'm just going to go over these relatively quickly, it's really kind of weighing more towards adult females. It's weighing more towards female and male juveniles. Again, it doesn't really track contextually. It's being thrown off by that strong response to adult females. So it's actually helpful to be able to have that silhouette width statistic to determine, is this anything I can really use? Because again, this would probably, if without that information and without the context, this would suggest on its own, in isolation of anything else, that this person is probably showing more response to adult females than anything else, and we know that's not really his pattern overall. So there's definitely something going on there. When we look at the subjective reports, again, not surprisingly, I'm not going to go into too much information on this. The cluster analysis for the subjective responses was significant. It was actually 0.66. This is going to be obviously more susceptible to tampering if a person wants to throw something off. In this dendrogram, the adult male category was clustering by itself, everything else was alone. To cut to the chase, the overall conclusion was that there was a non-zero chance that this individual was trying to throw off his look scores on this. He was trying to possibly, to go back to our Z-scores for a second, he was trying to elevate the adolescent male category. It's not, you never really got a clear understanding about why he wasn't necessarily doing anything with the adult male category, but he could have had some skewed perception about how this was going. Maybe he was thinking, maybe he didn't really realize how it was calculated, but knowing the individual, knowing their background, knowing their history of not being genuine in evaluations, in treatment, in other situations, there was a overall belief that this was not necessarily reflecting of their pattern of sexual attraction. The final report, we didn't explicitly say that he was trying to fake it, but definitely we said that his pattern of responding was not consistent with usable information. So definitely there are those times that, you know, if you read between the lines, you can kind of get the gist of what's going on there. But to be able to prove positive, say that this person was trying to throw it off, we can suspect it, but we can't really come right out and say it. But certainly as we delve more deeply into those analyses, we can start to kind of ask ourselves those questions and have a little bit more context to be able to examine, you know, is the responses. And that's one of the things that's nice about the dendrograms is if it is not a valid dendrogram, that also gives us more information about overall, is this a profile we want to use? And I would say that more for the viewing times, the objective response, more than the subjective response. If that's not valid, then certainly it calls into question the usefulness of this scoring in of itself. And in this case, we didn't necessarily use this information strongly in support of much. We ended up, if anything, this was reflective of some of the other personality-based issues and concerns we were having. So, you know, all data is data, and you know, the key is to make sure that you're using it in a useful and valid way. So that is the general overview of what the look assessment EVS covers. Again, we're not associated with the look team. I do not represent them. We are not endorsed by them. So if you have any questions about that, please reach out to me directly through dynamicpsych.net. Again, that's my website for dynamic psychological solutions. Always happy to consult on something like this. If there are any recommendations about information that you can possibly consider that might be helpful, I'm always open to that in terms of looking at how we can continue to build out the EVS process. For right now, we're on version 1.1. The initial version was not automated, so I was initially charging for its use, and I figured out the automation process before this really got too far. So for the meantime, it is available for use to anyone who is a valid and authorized user of the look assessment. Information about the specific terms of use are all available there on the website. If in the future, due to data processing costs, if we have to go back to a pay-for-use model, you know, that will definitely be reflected in this video. But for now, it's available for anyone to use. So yeah, I think I'm going to leave this here. I hope it was helpful. If there are more questions, again, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day.